Good evening, dans ce moment solennel. Welcome back to our spring session of Another Look. Delighted to have you with us. We are here to discuss Philip Larkin's novel, The Girl in Winter. And we have two discussants with us that I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from. Elizabeth Conquest, better known as Liddie, received her PhD in rhetoric, linguistics, and literature from the University of Southern California, wrote a doctoral dissertation on movement poetry, which is a kind of name that's loosely associated with Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, and
Donald Davies,
and Robert Conquest, her husband. And she taught English and communications courses at the University of Texas at El Paso between 74 and 79. She's the editor of the complete poems of Robert Conquest, to be published in the spring of 2019 by Waywiser Press. Two Muses, her husband's memoirs, and is currently editing the selected letters of Robert Conquest, many of which entail correspondence with Philip Larkin himself. And we will learn from Liddie some inside information about Philip Larkin's biography and where this particular book fits within, his trajectory as a writer. Philip Larkin, of course, is better known as a poet than as a novelist, and it will be interesting for us tonight to discuss in what way the poet Philip Larkin is at work in this novel, which this might be a minority view, but it's my view that what he achieves in this novel goes beyond anything that he actually accomplished as a poet. Is that fair to say? I'm not sure. It's hard to ever compare something like a poem and a novel, or even a corpus of poems with a novel. However, I think Liddie will be telling us in her remarks about the way in which Philip Larkin thought that the novel was a more, what's the word he used, noble? Or a more noble genre than poetry. I don't know if I agree with that, but it reminded me when we were speaking about this coming over, at dinner before coming over, of Michelangelo's attitude towards sculpture versus painting, that he thought that sculpture was a three-dimensional art and that God created in the form of sculpture, as opposed to painting, which he excelled at, yet at the same time he felt that painting was kind of missing one dimension that sculpture itself had. And when I read A Girl in Winter, I find that there's something about that third dimension that appeals to me greatly. Not that some of Larkin's best poems don't arrive at that kind of height of sublimity, but for sure. Fortunately, we don't have to, choose between them. We have them all. Tobias Wolff, you all know, and we can't get enough of Tobias Wolff here on Another Look for discussion, so you know what you're in for with him. And before I turn the word over to Liddie, whom I asked to start first, I just wanted to read aloud the opening of A Girl in Winter in order to have a look at the way in which the poet is at work in the evocation of snow on the landscape of England. And before I read it aloud, let me just remind you that there's an evocation of a snow that has fallen, and it begins in the fields and the woods, and then it moves gradually to the village, and then to the railways, and finally it gets to the provincial town or city where the action of the novel will take place. And so there's it's almost like a if you were a film director and we're trying to do this Visually, you would imagine something beginning with a broad sort of thing and narrowing gradually down into the particular, which in many ways is the obverse of what the poets are supposed to be doing, which is starting with the particular and then giving a universal significance, to that particularity. So let me just remind you of this opening, because I know that Toby will have some things to say about that, right? There had been no more snow during the night, but because the frost continued so that the drifts lay where they had fallen, people told each other there was more to come. And when it grew lighter, it seemed that they were right, for there was no sun, only one vast shell of cloud over the fields and woods. In contrast to the snow, the sky looked brown. Indeed, without the snow, the morning would have resembled a January nightfall, for what light there was seemed to rise up from it. It lay in ditches and in hollows in the fields where only birds walked. In some lanes, the winds had swept it up faultlessly to the very tops of the hedges. Villages were cut off until gangs of men could clear a passage on the roads. The laborers could not go out to work, and on the aerodromes near the villages, all flying remained canceled. People who lay ill in bed could see the shine off the ceilings of their rooms, and a puppy, confronted with it for the first time, howled and crept under the water butt. The outhouses were roughly powdered down the windward side. The fences were half submerged like breakwaters. The whole landscape was so white and still, it might have been a formal painting. People were unwilling to get up. To look at the snow too long had a hypnotic effect, drawing away all power of concentration, and the cold seemed to cramp the bones, making work harder and unpleasant. Nevertheless, the candles had to be lit, and the ice in the jugs smashed, and the milk unfrozen. The men had to be given their breakfasts and got off to work in the yards. Life had to be carried on in no matter what circumscribed way. Even though one went no further than the window seat, there was still plenty to be done indoors, saved for such time as this. But through the cuttings and along embankments ran the railway lines, and although they were empty, they led on northwards and southwards till they began to join, passing factories that had worked all night, and the backs of houses where light showed round the curtains, reaching the cities where the snow was disregarded and which the frost could only besiege for a few days bitterly. So when you read a novel that begins that way, you know that a voice is speaking there that is uncommon, that has challenges us to awaken ourselves to the poetry that is going to be the essence of the book, more perhaps than the story, the narrative, and the plot. The story does have characters and narratives and settings and so forth, and there's a great deal of these elements that we'll be discussing tonight, but an opening signal like that kind of tells us that we're in a higher realm of rarefaction, of poetic rarefaction. And let me just read one paragraph, which is not the very end, but the penultimate paragraph of the book, because in the first page there's a promise that people understood that there was more snow to come. What does it mean that they're anticipating more snow to come? And as you know, this whole story really takes place in one day, part one and part two, and it's like a winter husk around a seed of the summer memory of what takes place years before. And the snow finally does come much later that night, when Robin is there in the apartment with Catherine. And here is how the penultimate paragraph reads. There was the snow and her watch ticking, so many snowflakes, so many seconds. As time passed, they seemed to mingle in their minds, heaping up into a vast shape that might be a burial mound or the cliff of an iceberg whose summit is out of sight. Into its shadow, dreams crowded, full of conceptions and stirrings of cold, as if ice floes were moving down a lightless channel of water. They were going in orderly, slow procession, moving from darkness further into darkness, allowing no suggestion that their order should be broken or that one day, however many years distant, the darkness would begin to give place to light. So there we have first page and last page to get us into the mood. So now I'm going to join my fellow discussants on the stage, and we're going to ask Liddie to start us off.
In a letter that Philip Larkin wrote to my husband, he says, "Life is a precarious edifice balanced on facts that may give way at any moment." And I think that is an apt description of Larkin's approach in a way to life, regarded as the greatest poet laureate that never was, because he turned it down. His reputation when he died in 1985 was at a high point. Then followed some winter years when his executors published a biography and a selected letters that revealed Larkin at his worst. And for some time, the outcry was such that some of the most outraged said, well, we won't even teach his stuff anymore. It's just not, it's beyond the pale. But time seems to have forgiven Larkin, and he's regained his status as the best-loved poet since the Second World War in Britain. The Times named him that in a 2008 survey, although with a slight proviso, he was, it is now generally agreed, not a very nice man. Sort of elegant understatement. For those who knew Philip Larkin, nothing could be further than the truth, personally, among his friends. In any case, he was witty, amusing, good company, courtly in his behavior, an excellent administrator. But if we look back on his life, we might see seeds that come to fulfillment in this novel. He was born on the 9th of August 1922 in Coventry, a largish industrial town. And his father was the city treasurer, an able administrator himself, and very well read at a time when one wouldn't expect this. Their house was filled with novels by Lawrence, Joyce, and his favorite Thomas Hardy, who really became a major factor in his son's works. He went to grammar school there, made two friends. His childhood was not particularly happy, and as we know, an unhappy childhood can sometimes leave poisonous residue, and it seems to have had that effect on Larkin. At age 16, he spoke of himself at that age saying, "I didn't know any girls." Of course, he was going to an all-boys school, and neither did any of my friends. So the opposite sex was a mystery that he never managed to crack in some ways, and he was uncomfortable. He stammered. He wore glasses. In fact, he stammered so badly that until he was 30, when he was buying a ticket, for example, a rail ticket, he would hand over a note that said single return Birmingham, because he just couldn't get those words out. And it was controlled later, but you can see how it might have made life, how he might have been tormented at school, and how it might have stood in the way of success with girls. He went to he went to Oxford in 1940, and 2 weeks after he arrived, on the night of 14 November 1940, Coventry was bombed, and the center of the town almost obliterated. And so some of the finest medieval buildings in the country were suddenly in ruins. He waited to hear from his parents to see if hear any word, and after 2 days, having heard nothing, he hitchhiked back to Coventry and walked through this ruined city where I'm sure most of you have seen at one time or another what bombing does to buildings, where you might pass half of a house gone and the teacup still hanging on a hook. May well have fires have been burning. And he found that his parents had gone, his mother had gone to stay with her sister, and his father was actually stayed in the city. But it was sort of, for someone who's extremely sensitive to the point of overly sensitive and pessimistic from a very young age, and with a great fear of death, even as a teenager. And most teenagers think they're immortal, but not Larkin. This had, I think, an effect that we see that spreads through his life, and certainly his first novel, Jill, which is a kind of coming-of-age Oxford, mostly about his Oxford days. He recreates that scene in that novel where the parents who he really couldn't wait to get away for, suddenly he's trying desperately to get home to see if they're alive, and promising he'll be anything if they are alive. And that's a very, very, I think he does that part really well in Jill. He wrote 2.5 novels. He had during his teenage years, his father, who actually traveled to Germany on business a number of times for learning certain things from a finance minister there, and liked Germany, and they holidayed twice in Germany. And when he was 15, they went to a holiday camp in Germany called Koningswinter. And the original title of A Girl in Winter was The Kingdom of Winter. Faber, who published the novel, pressed him to change it, and so the novel has this name, but he said he always thought of this novel as The Kingdom of Winter, and it was to be the center of a book in a trilogy. The kind of age of innocence in Jill, loss of innocence in A Girl in Winter, and then the regeneration, the new life in the third novel, which he was never able to complete. What's remarkable about the first 2 novels is how young he was when he wrote them. He finished. He began Jill in summer of 43 when he was 21 years old, and finished it the next year. He wrote The Kingdom of Winter in 44, 45, putting the finishing touches on the final manuscript just about VE Day. And so he'd done these 2 novels by the time he was 22. Took a little bit longer to get published. But in the meantime, the following year, when he was 23, his first book of poems, The North Ship, was published. And those poems were not his best work by any means, leaning heavily on Yeats. A lot of, you could just see Yeats leaping out of many a page. But he was just always such a pessimistic person. In Oxford, when he was at Oxford as an undergraduate, it wasn't the Oxford of Brideshead Revisited. There was rationing. People came for a short time. As soon as they got old enough to be called up, they were called up. So people cycled through. You didn't have the same person all the way through. And he was sure he'd be called up. So the last term, when he turned 19, was old enough to be called up, and was called in for his physical. When he went home for Christmas, he was sure he'd go and be killed, of course, and because that was how things always worked for him. And so he burnt all his notes. He sold all his books, and he went home. And on New Year's Day, got a message that he'd flunked the physical because of his bad eyesight. So then he had to rush back to Oxford. He had to buy back his books. The notes were gone. And study like mad. And so then his letters to everyone are all full of, well, I know I'm going to I probably will fail. I couldn't possibly pass. It's the end of everything. Yes, there's no way. Well, he got a first. And so when he finished at Oxford, he went back home for a bit. He applied for a job in the civil service. He didn't get it. Then it was suggested that he might go to Bletchley Park to help with the code breaking, but he didn't get that job either. And he began writing in the attic of his parents' home, the new house they bought in Warwick. And he had 2 attic rooms, and attics become a favored spot, away from everyone. And he had many, during his early life, he had many rooms that were in attics or on top floors. But the Ministry of Labor sent him a note saying, so what are your plans? So then he thought, well, I better look for something. And so he'd seen an advertisement for a librarianship in Wellington, a small town, and he thought, well, okay, I don't know anything about that, but I have to be doing something. So he applied and he got the job. And he was a kind of one-man show, so that the parts in this novel discussing what librarians do, he was doing all of those things while he was writing this novel, because he said the beauty of being the job was that from 1 to 3 he could be in his office, wasn't needed in the library, and he could write. And he found that a useful profession, and he actually became very, very good at it. But in any case, these novels were then published. Faber took Jill. Jill was published by the Fortune Press in 1946, and A Girl in Winter was published by Faber and Faber in 1947. So he's extremely young for having accomplished that much, and he takes the job there. He privately prints a volume of poetry called 20 Poems. He's again in romantic attics, where he's taken a bedsitter, and his view is always of treetops, and we find trees throughout his poems, and also in his novels as well. And so his very early works have an acute awareness of nature and the life-givingness of nature. And we see that in the summer section of this novel. And we see, the only trees that really appear in the winter sections are bare branches, this sort of ominous appearance. one of the poems that he wrote, which about trees, is an awfully good one, and a fairly early one too. The trees. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh, in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. Of course, in this novel, we see trees, and in the summer section, there are trees that sort of, there are many descriptions, the willows that hang down over the punt, the, many descriptions of fields, sun, clouds. It's all kind of a prelapsarian paradise that stays in Catherine's mind as a perfect time. But things, as always, go not so swimmingly, and Larkin is the great refuser of maybe the life force. It almost is a favorite word in an Arundel tomb, where he comes across the effigies of the Duke and of Arundel, and ordinarily those effigies are lying side by side in churches with sometimes a little dog at the feet. But in this one, he notices that the Duke's hand is like this, and the wife's hand is here. But the end of that poem says, that this would prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love. But he's the great qualifier. Things are almost. So.
Great. Well, we'll
Lovely.
enter more into that with our
Sure.
discussion. Yeah, go.
Thanks, Liddie. It's fascinating to hear this. Maybe I'd love to get your sense maybe a little later in this conversation, just what he was actually like to be with. I mean, but the passage that you mentioned in Jill, that it's based on Larkin's going back to Coventry after it was bombed, it's a very poignant moment for the English to look back on, because they actually knew, the government knew that Coventry was going to be bombed, and they did not issue an evacuation order. And the reason that they did not was that they had obtained that intelligence through a project called Ultra, which they had to weigh the destruction and death that would result from that bombing against all the years of war that lay ahead of them, when they could perhaps save many more people by foreknowledge of German plans. But imagine having to make that decision of not telling people when you knew what was going to happen. And that kind of terror that people lived with underlies this novel. The bleakness of this day, the sense of deprivation that you feel in this novel, the teeth of cold kind of biting everybody, I think is just extraordinary. That passage that Robert read at the beginning is remarkable. And I know, Robert, you mentioned that that in some ways it reminded you of the wonderful ending of Joyce's The Dead, when Gabriel is looking out the window and sees the snow falling, imagines the snow falling on Michael Furie's headstone and filling Ireland, and it's gorgeous. It reminds me of of the beginning. You remember, there's a conversation in the novel between Jane and there are no books in the house, you remember, which Catherine notices. So the one writer that they talk about for just a brief moment in there is Dickens. And has she read Dickens? In fact, the English writer that she seems actually to have read is where she got her what she thought was her understanding of the English and their formality, which she read half a novel of Jane Austen. And this was her kind of a cultural equipment for this, for these weeks she's going to spend in England. But they're talking about Dickens, and this description of the winter at the beginning of this novel reminds me in many ways of Dickens' description of the fog coming in at the beginning of Bleak House. If you have not read that, you don't even have to read the whole novel, though actually you do, but just read the first page and a half of Bleak House. It is one of the great tour de force in our language, and there are certain moments in here that really, for me, echo Dickens' description of the fog coming in. Says even the street lamps have a haggard and unwilling look, and describes people horses slipping in the mire like that puppy who howls at this unfamiliar sight. He's got those little details. There's one in there of a little cabin boy shivering in the hold of the ship that he's on in the Thames. Just the vividness of that, and Larkin is so steeped in that literature of his country that those things become part of your your blood and muscle as a writer. And one of the things that strikes me about this novel, I really love Larkin's poetry. I think he's just a wonderful poet. What perhaps you don't look for in Larkin's poetry, despite the cold as it is evoked here, is a kind of human warmth that I find in this novel, and it's an extremely humane novel. It's not, it's really not sentimental. He's not really asking you to fall in love with any of these characters. There's no thumbs on the scales here at all. And yet you do. They're so vivid and actual. And also, we are so engaged from the beginning. How to make a novel out of a day in which someone you work with gets a toothache and you take them out to a dentist. And what an unpleasant dentist. And the novel grows from this cold, kind of ultra-realistic picture of a grinding, bleak life, and then it flowers into that summer. The tone that it seamlessly alters into that picture of yearning, of young people fumbling around in an attempt to connect with each other. That excruciating scene in the punt, and just Jane's presence, and just their difficulty in connecting with each other. There's a wonderful scene in Anna Karenina when that in some ways watching these two circle each other and being unable ever to that awkward kiss finally at the end of the summer. There's a scene in Anna Karenina when Lev's brother and the governess of the family, the French governess, they obviously have a thing for each other but are unable ever to declare. So Lev and his wife, Kitty, dream up this excursion where they're going to go hunt for mushrooms. And they contrive to leave the two alone in the woods there to say what they have to say to each other, which they both actually do want to say to each other. And what happens, they get, the governor says, "This is such a beautiful day for mushroom picking." And Lev's brother says, "Yes, isn't it though? And I think it's the best day this summer." And the governor says, "Yes, and so many mushrooms here in this part of the..." They can't stop. They are in this eddy, this whirlpool of small talk that we have all been in at one time, and they never are able to do it. And the moment ends. And in some ways, I watch these young people circle each other in the opening here, and it's touching, it's actual, it's familiar at the deepest level, and just I just find it emotionally engaging in a way that, as much as I love Larkin's poetry, I do not find that same. It doesn't affect me in that way. I don't know, Robert.
So maybe we could pick up on the theme of the winter and cold versus warmth. You said there's a humane warmth that you felt in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know which characters exude it in particular.
I think more it's the that's interesting. I think it's more the attitude of, and it's not sentimental, but it's the attitude of the writer toward the characters, right, is where the warmth is to be found.
I agree with that.
Not so much toward each other. I mean, Catherine in those last scenes, will he leave, oh God, okay, I'm gonna probably have to give him what he wants, and tick, tick, tick. But and there's a, it's very real, it's rather dark, but you also comprehend how this came about. I don't actually blame her. He has showed up. He had been this rather beautiful boy, self-possessed, apparently cultivated, and this coarse, grasping soldier shows up, drunk, and yeah. So I don't, I don't fault her, and I don't fault him either. This. At one point, he talks about, well, I saw the family, I may not see them again. And that was a pretty good bet that he wouldn't. These were in the darkest years of the war. They were losing everywhere and being shipped out to be killed somewhere else. So, he doesn't have much time. This is a girl he's been thinking about for years. He doesn't know how to express himself. He's gotten drunk probably exactly because he's nervous and yearning for one wonderful thing to happen before he ships out. But there's nothing in the attitude of the writer toward the characters that is cruel or cold.
I agree entirely. That the writer, the way the book is written is what sustains our interest and investment in the characters and what happens to them. Otherwise, their interaction between themselves seem to suffer from a freezing effect, a coldness.
Yeah.
But there's a brief thaw. I'm not talking about the last going to bed together, but there is a little. It isn't meant, I don't think, for us to think that it's permanent. But what strikes a kind of human warmth in Catherine in the winter husks. We see it in the beginning where Miss Green has the toothache. She's taking her along, and getting her on the bus and asking her, you know, are you okay? And there's a passage there where she suddenly feels and recognizes that she has not felt for years a concern about someone else.
Right.
And she then, you know, she's yearning to go home to see if Robin's come, or if you know, if there's a message, is there a letter, you know, she's thinking all the time they're on the bus, although every minute's ticking away, and yet he might be there and I might be missing him. But she sticks with this because Miss Green needs the help. And then at the end, I think she sleeps with Robin because she senses his fear. And once again, someone needs something and she gives that. But of course she lets, you know, there's lots of hints that this isn't a permanent thing.
Oh, yeah.
Because she says she's never going to love anyone again. She's never going to trust anyone again. And then the final moments in the novel that I think reflect, I think it's pretty firm there that the regeneration that you see in the natural cycles of nature and the rebirths are not going to happen for her. And so maybe now's the time to just, I marked this because I thought it was interesting where right, the last paragraph right following what Robert read a little while ago. Yet the passage of the ice flows, inevitably going down in order. Yet their passage was not saddening. Unsatisfied dreams rose and fell about them, crying out against their implacability, but in the end glad that such order, such destiny existed. Against this knowledge, the heart, the will, and all that made for protest could at last sleep. And that's why a friend sent me an email, lives in Texas, saying, oh, well, don't you think it'll all work out and, you know, he'll survive the war and they'll get married at the end? I said, not a chance.
No.
A very early poem of Larkin's, very, very early, speaks to this last paragraph in the book. It's called Wants. Beyond all this, the wish to be alone. However the sky grows dark with invitation cards, however we follow the printed directions of sex, however the family is photographed under the flagstaff, beyond all this, the wish to be alone. Beyond it all, the desire for oblivion runs, despite the artful tensions of the calendar, the life insurance, the tabled fertility rites, the costly aversion of the eyes away from death. Beneath it all, the desire for oblivion runs. And I think, maybe because I'm more steeped in the poetry, I just think that this is his view. This is probably what made his life not a happy one. And I see Catherine in that way.
Well, Catherine,
so-
too, she's come to this place traumatized by what has happened. Larkin is some might think excessively careful in not saying exactly where she's from, but we know she's from a country that has been, that has suffered the worst of the war, and that she's managed to escape. And she remembers this time in coming there, from making it out of there and being in London as stark terror, as everything, as she says, collapsing around her. Then she can trust no one. She trusts no one. And then that conversation she has with this Miss Parbury that she takes the purse to, Anstey's beloved. And she says, well, you have to take care of yourself, don't you? That's the argument that she makes, you can't just be giving all of yourself to other people. You have to look out for yourself and do what you know, and really making an argument for a pretty tough and solitary life, because that is what she has been schooled to by history at this point. She's been, so again, it's one of those things where without the author editorializing about her, we sense in her history, the makings of this rather flinty character that we encounter at the end.
Well, there's several questions that are raised by both of your interventions. To begin with, the idea of thawing is something that recurs often, and I'm more interested in the metaphorics of the novel more than maybe the plot or in the psychology, because that's where the poet is at work for me. And the winter setting, there's coldness, but there's always this tea going, or the heaters, and this kind of fight against the cold.
Yeah.
And the tea is always getting cold. The heaters are not working. You have to put in the coils.
Warm milk.
Warm milk, exactly. And then there's the sense of isolation of one person from another. And although the poem that you read seems to suggest that Larkin, the author of the book, had resigned himself to this kind of lonely isolation, it's I think it's belied by the dynamics of the book and the relation between Robin and Catherine, especially at the end, where there is an attempt, certainly on his part, to reach out, extend beyond himself, and to establish some connection in the middle of winter, which stands also as a metaphor for the distance that separates one person from another. And this, let's not forget that England is an island, after all. And island and isolation is native to the British psyche, and the difficulty of overcoming the intrinsic inhibitions of the English state of mind, where human relations are kind of troubled in general, more than in a Mediterranean climate, for example, makes for the pathos of a scene at the end where you have a series of failures to actually get on the same wavelength. And the novel is written from within the subjective interiority of Catherine. It would be a completely different story if it were written from within the subjectivity of Robin.
Sure.
So we can only imagine what Robin imagines about Catherine.
Yeah.
But the point being is that they are there isolated at the top of a building. And those last pages, she's extremely conscious at a certain point of the two of them being alone in a very dark moment and in a world where all meaning has deliquesced, and that there is a certain solidarity in their solitude. And there's this sound of the watch that keeps ticking. And 3 or 4 times, Robin says, can you put that watch away? Or something. It's making a real row. He is extremely troubled by the tyranny of chronometric time, where even when this watch is put away, he hears the bell tower, and here is someone who is going to go off very soon. He doesn't think he's going to make it back. I probably shan't, he says. And therefore, the limitedness of time, and Catherine cannot understand the appeal that he's making to her because he's making it in a very awkward language. Yeah. And what he says to her repeatedly is, will you write me letters? So I'd like to ask the question to both of you, for example, about what is the role of letters in the novel. Because she doesn't get it. From my point of view, she doesn't understand at all what he's asking of her when he says, will you write me some letters? She says, I don't know if I can write letters. But their relationship began with letter writing. Mm-hmm. The novel begins with her writing a letter to the Fennels, will I reestablish contact? There's also his letter, or the mother's letter that comes back, and there are there's the letter in the purse of Purdy. So these communications over distance, and that distance is also the winter. How do you overcome the distance and through words where everything is susceptible to misreading and misunderstanding?
Good point.
So
her Larkin correspondence, of course, was because it was in Hull. Many of his close friends were not.
right.
That correspondence was a way of keeping in touch, and in some ways consolation, because in his the last really fine poem he wrote was Obad, and it ends, doctors like postmen come across the field. The idea that bringing messages of consolation, and so I hadn't thought about the letters that crop up all the way through.
Well, and you're editing the correspondences,
so
it's
so I know what he says in his
doing,
letters.
right.
Yeah, some of it anyway.
So maybe Toby or Liddie, the chronometric time is tick tock, and that's death. That only has one outcome, which is death, and that means that every moment is isolated from the next, and you live in a kind of time. You live in a time that does not allow for the flowering of the fulfillment of potential and maturity. Miss Purdy is described as someone who has gone from youth to old age without any transition as a mature woman. Why does Robin propose to Catherine a marriage? What is this deeper sentiment that he's trying to communicate without communicating it articulately? What is it that she can give him through her letters or through her promise to marry him that will provide some kind of counter to the tyranny of chronometric time? I have a feeling that it will integrate the seasons of time. She's belonged to a past, a projection into a future, a present, that it will enable him to inhabit time in a different way than this tick-tock of the watch keep moving forward.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a sort of desperation in that proposal, and maybe it's an anchor. He imagines it as an anchor, having a wife or a fiancée that will pull him back. He feels cut off from his family, doesn't think he'll see them again. It's some promise of connection. She knows better.
And, when you think about wartime, think of all the wartime marriages.
Oh, yeah.
There's always a desperate grasping at life.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's always a baby boom as a
Right,
result.
but
I can't, I guess I'm not as sympathetic to him as you are. In other words, I think he's desperate, but I don't think he wants somebody to care about him, and to feel.
Somebody.
I like that anchor.
He wants her to care.
Well, he wants her because she's available. Who else is he going to meet? That's right outside his camp.
He could meet someone that he has no past relation with.
Yeah, well.
And that would entrap him in this present that is just punctual, isolated present.
You feel that there's more. I don't know. He didn't display any mad keenness about her
But this
at
is
the
yeah, but
beginning
that's
of
the
this,
great thing
you
about
know.
Larkin is that he, as Toby says, there's no sentimentality about love and romance. So he's not going to give us the cliched love of a woman. Catherine is associated with his past, his family. She says, "You're almost like part of the family because my sister named the daughter
There's a connection there
after
that
you."
she's not acknowledging, I think, and that's
She's
true.
not acknowledged. She refuses to, or refuses, or is unable to.
Well, you know, Larkin tried his hand at the happy ending version of the story like this. He wrote it in one day as a kind of woman's magazine romance, and he even has the names. It's Pamela Fenton, I think it is, and Robbie, and he's shipping out, and she's making milk and with her rationed tea, and he turns up, and they have this romance, and they spend the day, and it's all going to be great, and she goes to the train with him, and 2 years before, Strangers, what's the famous Strangers on a Train? 2 years before that movie it came out, he writes that same scene in the railway, and then she goes off, and he is full of he's kind of almost making fun of that, and she felt noble and wonderful as he's going off to war. So he tried out that story and gave
For money.
incidents.
For money.
No, he bound it up. He didn't, but it was a riff on that.
Exactly.
But he it was called Incident at an English Camp, and so he did that while he, before. And he very rarely writes in a woman's voice. He one poem only, Wedding Wind, told where the speaker's a woman. But I don't know, I just sort of feel like Robin's on a carousel and he's grasping the brass ring, and so.
Do you agree with that, Toby?
Well, she has thought a lot about that summer that she spent there, and she let it go. I mean, she realized that this was not for her. I imagine that he has thought a lot about it, and perhaps with, a different, as you said, it would be a different novel from his point of view. And maybe in his point of view, it's a romantic memory, and that he cherishes some sense of her as someone romantically special and possible in his life. I'd be curious to know what other people think too about that.
Well, we can open it up very soon, but can I just make one more plea for Robin? And it's not the first time I'm defending the guys.
Yeah.
In another look, but let's see, what are we? So here's a scene at the end of the summer section where they're on the river. She doesn't know it's a Thames river. And she asks, Robin, what is this river called? And he says, why, the Thames, of course. She said, not the real Thames, certainly. And then he added with mild amusement, if we'd lived in prehistoric times, before England was an island, I could nearly have taken you home. The Thames used to flow into the Rhine. Now, I don't know what it's like to be a woman of the other gender, but if I were a young woman and someone said that to me, I would find that completely enchanting, poetic. I mean, what more beautiful thing can a guy say? And yet, a few lines later, in the next paragraph, she says, there was something formal about him, as if he were a figure in allegory, carrying her a stage further on some undefined journey. She doubted if she would ever think that again of anyone. And she smiled to remember her disregarded belief that he might at any moment say something that she would never forget. Which means she's going to forget what he just said, but that's her shortcoming. It's not his shortcoming. He has given, you know, a statement that is full of potential for association and connection between the England and the continent before they got separated by the sea, and all sorts of things. The understatement of Robin is something that's too subtle for her, because she is more of a literalist. She does not have a poetic mind, which is extraordinary, because we get into her character even though she doesn't at all share the author's poetic sensibility at all.
No, she just shares the author's view of life.
Yes, it's true.
She's an instrument for that. I agree that actually that is, you know, pretty good for a teenage boy. And,
Yes, but
and,
let me.
But then, you know, so's the lunge. It's typical. But somehow, you know, it's as if she can't. She might have once, but it's like the silver hairbrush, you know, with
Right, of her
very
grandfather.
significant object in the novel. Two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. So if you wanted to say that maybe she's has the knowledge and therefore he's more along the life things, but it's sort of like a thwarting of the situation myth where the hero has gone questing and yet he fails. There's not going to be, I mean, in my mind, I look at this novel and think there will be no, he's even got the goddess, but there's not going to be any spring and any regeneration in the natural cycle where the winter is killed and in the Winter King. And remember, this is originally the Kingdom of Winter, and it was intended to be the middle book in a trilogy, and then he started the one where life would regenerate and characters, not these characters, but there'd be a set of characters who were going to go off. They'd have all the difficulties. They'd go off to the New World and start life again, and it would all be great. And he could not finish that novel. Right. And I don't think he had it in him to write anything more than a spoof happy ending. He just never thought it could possibly happen. And he has, I forget which it is, where he says about the possibility of that, something different from us chose. And I think she's not able to meet him. But I'm more sympathetic to Robin than I was when I started, now that you've persuaded me that he had
Well,
the gift
yeah,
of
but
gab.
as you said about how awkward he was with girls at a young age, with all his stammering and his awkward, you can imagine a kind of
the pun
covert
thing,
self-portrait in Robin, and how he is perceived by another woman,
yes.
and how all that poetic temperament and sensibility would just not even
Fringe.
register.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead, Toby. You wanted to,
That's right.
yeah. You wanted to object to something.
Let's hear. No,
Yeah, let's open it up. Yeah.
Maybe you can know, is it on? Maybe you can know a little too much about the author. I think probably most of us in the room went to this text with our own experience, which is what most people do when they read something. But what I found interesting about the night of intimacy between the two of them, the way that I saw the connection, the misconnection, the desire, and what they each got of it, or what they were looking for, is that for him, she has survived the apocalypse that he is about to walk into. She, as the survivor, at some point in the story talks about, you know, she's having trouble with this job. She goes, well, I'll do this or I'll do that. She knows she is going to continue, but she's hollowed out because she's lost everything and everyone she cares about. So there is this remnant that they each have of themselves in each other. And I think all they get out of it is perhaps a night of respite, But I think when you're in the kingdom of winter, that's as good as you can hope for at any point in time. So I found it very hopeful, rather than, I don't know if hopeful is the right word, but I didn't find it depressing, and while they certainly didn't connect and find their inner souls together or anything like that, they both got a breath before they moved on. Anyway.
Well said. And that's the humane warmth that Toby was talking about.
There's the warmth you were looking for.
It would have been very bleak had she refused.
Yeah.
That would have been such a miserly, lack of generosity and a complete lack of understanding of the situation and
Why it's written by a 23-year-old and not a 50-year-old.
right.
I was wondering whether you might say something about Jane, who was pretty big in this novel, and her, she was really the one who instigated this travel, and the letters that he was writing back to Catherine were partially dictated by her. I mean, that she was very involved in this, and I mean, that her realization that these letters were not so much by him or they really involved this other person so much changed her view of what her whole memory had been. And I thought that was one of the reasons that she wasn't going to write any more letters to him, because she didn't actually feel like that first foray into letter writing had been kind of true. But you can talk to more about that, probably.
Well, she was outraged to discover that Jane had, in fact, been reading those letters, and in fact that it wasn't Robin who had wanted her to come. It was Jane who'd wanted her to come, which goes to, Jane's need and loneliness. Then you understand it retrospectively why she was always with them, because she really thought that she had brought Catherine there and that she belonged to her in some way. So that, yes, that's a that whole business with the letters, and we can't forget the initial impression that those letters made on Catherine when, he was always just talking about bicycling somewhere. And so, she's also betraying him. She's reading the letters to her friends, and they call him the bicyclist. That's the name, and it sets off laughter every time it's mentioned. So, there's that kind of betrayal on both ends of the letter.
And it seems as if Catherine meant much more to Jane than to Robin in the beginning. Then we have to argue whether or not later, but there's the shock of misunderstanding that it turns out that the baby who died, the middle name was Catherine.
Yeah.
And so that's a reminder that Jane had felt something very strong for Catherine, and yearned for a friendship, hoped she'd be invited back, all the things that didn't happen, and then of course she marries the tiger hunting Jack Stormalong, which is just such a maybe over the top choice.
It's a Dickens name. It's a Dickens name.
Yeah, but so everybody's eyes, her eyes are glazing over at the tiger hunt, but she can't imagine why Jane would say yes. So there's that moment of shock when she says, "I've had my first proposal of marriage, and I've accepted," and that's the end of the summer. So it's.
Other questions?
Given his problem with women, it's intriguing that this is from the point of view of a woman, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are about why and how he achieved it also.
Well, he'd practiced the woman's point of view, I suppose, while the last year at Oxford, writing a bunch of sort of girls' school stories in this, which is a kind of genre that is sort of like for boys. It was Tom Brown's School Days, and so he wrote under this, these what's called the Brunette Coleman works, where that's supposed to be the author, and he tried out these things out. But it surprises me because women were a complete mystery to Larkin at that age. He tried it when he was an undergraduate. I mean, he invited someone to tea, and she said, "I think I'd rather not." He took some flowers to one girl, and she opened the door, and he just couldn't even speak, and just handed her the flowers and rushed off. I mean, I think the awkwardness in Robin is well earned by the author. He was very much taken with a undergraduate from Czechoslovakia, but she was a committed Marxist, so if you were trying to kiss her, she'd be suddenly talking about the masses. And he just didn't have any luck at all, while most other undergraduates were. But he made some friendships the last year, and he wrote the Willow Gables girls' stories and read them to his friends, and they were very witty and amusing. And so he tried out the woman's voice, and I just think it's remarkable that he would write. I think it's convincing. I believed in Catherine, and I think it's a major accomplishment that he's able to do that, because he really didn't know, and he feared and was baffled by women. He, in addition to the stammer and the glasses, he was beginning to lose his hair in his 20s. He writes in a letter, my baldness seems to be proceeding pretty well, and he was 27. And so it was, I don't know, maybe you write about something that you want to understand. Do you think that's a possibility? But anyway, I think that he makes us believe in her.
Yeah, I agree. The female subjectivity is very convincing, I find.
Yeah.
And but it's also remarkable if one thinks that he was 22 when he was writing this, and there are these experiences. You would think that you would have to be, in your 50s or 60s to have gone through the kind of maturation process that Catherine goes through. I'm going to read, from the scene where she's on the bus and she's having this moment of self, examination, and taking stock of how much has changed in her life since the disaster that has turned her into an immigrant into a strange land. And it's page 183 in my edition. It says, "For she knew now that in most lives there had come a break when the past dropped away and the maturity it had enclosed for so long stood painfully upright. It came through death or disaster, or even through a love affair that with the best will in the world on both sides went wrong. Certainly there were people to whom it never came. Girls she had known had slipped cozily from childhood to marriage, and their lives would be one long, unintelligent summer." But once the break was made, as though continually trickling sand had caused a building to slip suddenly on its foundation so that perhaps one single ornament fell to the floor, life ceased to be a confused stumbling from one illumination to another, a series of unconnected clearings in a tropical forest, and became a flat landscape, wry and rather small, with a few unforgettable landmarks, somewhere resembling a stretch of fenland where an occasional dike or broken fence shows up for miles, and the sails of a mill turn all day long in the steady wind. All one sentence. Brilliant. But, I feel that at my age, not at 22, this is not kind of typical of someone of that age, and he was writing it in the same circumstances under which the novel is described. Namely, he was writing it during the war. The war had not ended yet. He was the same age, more or less, as Catherine, and yet he had become a kind of old man already in a certain way, or let's call it a certain kind of maturity.
Yeah, it's a very wintry wisdom at work there, for sure.
And in just the next page too, that wintry wisdom, she was not going to be surprised anymore. She was not going to trust anybody. She was not going to love anybody. And when the time came for her to die, she would die not only without having done anything worthwhile, like most people, but without having done anything she wanted. And so she.
Bleak
I mean,
house.
yep. I mean, part of us are saying, come on, Catherine, give it a go, but she's not able to, and
it doesn't mean that what she's saying there about the future will be true either. That is how she feels at that moment, though.
But does she feel any different at the end? Do you think?
No.
Well, it's the same day.
She might.
Well,
it's the same. Later in the day. What I mean is, at the end of the novel, later in the day, she hasn't changed that bleak feeling about what her future may hold.
Autobiographical in any way, because from what you talked about him, he seemed to have been rejected a lot by women, and I wondered if you felt it's autobiographical.
Well, he felt, I think at that point in his life, he probably hadn't had a lot of success with women. Don't forget, there were 3 mistresses at the deathbed. But I don't want to get into the, as you pointed out, we can, if we know too much about an author, then we just read everything through that lens, and maybe we miss something very important. It was just that he's able, perhaps, to, it just seems remarkable that at such a young age, but he was always sure he was going to die. He was always afraid of death. He wrote great poems about this fear, and he just wasn't able to give anything of himself to anyone. He wrote to his boyhood friend about this same time that he just felt that if he were to be in a relationship or to fall in love, that it would mean that somebody else was more important than you were, and that it would get in the way of what you wanted to do, and you wouldn't be able to write. And he made a conscious decision to make sure that never happened.
Did he ever have a long-term relationship?
Oh yes, he had a 30-year relationship with Monica Jones, but it was a long-distance relationship, and it wasn't until she became very ill in 1982, and he died in 1985, that he, having put off the obligations of marriage all those years, she was ill, and then she came to live with him and was with him when, being looked after. And he wrote to my husband saying, "I'm having to look after Monica, not, as you can imagine, that's not doing it very well." But he always met his, a certain amount of his responsibilities. But I think we could say he wasn't honest in his own life, and or his relationships. But it was always the work. That was the most important thing. And if he cut himself off from everything else, that was fine, because he wanted to do what he wanted to do. And although he did complain, he might end up never having had any life. And in some ways, that's true.
Maybe in the direction of hopefulness from this book. I thought the passages that you were discussing right at the end are very bleak, but she has such strong opinions that are very changing throughout the entire book. So her opinions of Robin in particular, at any page in the book you could turn to, she thinks he's wonderful, she thinks he's horrible, he's ignoring her, he's flirting with her, and it's almost at an opposite to what is being offered to her at any time, that she feels the exact opposite of that offering. And so I wonder if the bleakness there is maybe in response to the potential that could come in the future. So she sees She sees maybe a potential for things to develop, and she takes a strong stance at work, and all of a sudden this guy that she's been waiting for is coming, and so she pulls back, and it's got to be a bleak response. So I'm not sure. Maybe you could talk to that.
What do you feel that there is some future?
Not necessarily
expectation?
between the two of them, but for her, so that she has a potential future that could blossom, and so she's reacting to that by putting out this bleakness, because that's what she's done throughout the entire book, that whenever something positive is offered to her, she has to have a negative internal response to it.
Well, this is in tension with what that passage that you read, Liddie, about the river Lethe and this desire for oblivion and sleep. She wants to go to sleep. He's saying, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Go to sleep. I'm really tired. I want to go to sleep." And she wants to shut it all down, as if to condemn it to or consign it to something that almost didn't happen at all, rather than allow herself to be seduced into thinking that it has some issue moving forward, and that maybe the lethic desire, I don't want to call it a death drive because I would be going too far, but that there's some will to oblivion that would foreclose a false expectation for the future. But I'm taking, Liddie's cue on that, because I'm not convinced myself that it's that.
But in Dockery and Son, one of his poems that's in the Less Deceived, which was the first real full collection of poems that he published. I mean, they've got the wonderful ending to one poem where who is the less deceived, the victim or the rapist who stumbles into fulfillment's desolate attic. And in Dockery of Son, when they recognize as they're going on a train trip, they're going past Coventry, where he grew up, and yet he doesn't recognize it. Well, one reason could be half of it was destroyed, but he, can't figure out exactly why. Others marry, others are fruitful, others have happiness, and he seems not, the narrator seems not to have done it, and he's wondering why. His traveling companion has all those things, and yet he doesn't. The lines are. Something different from us chose, something to do with violence a long time in the past. And so Catherine's been a victim of violence in her past, and it's making it difficult for her to have any in these normal human connections, which are seen as desirable, but for some unobtainable.
Cynthia, we don't have that much time left, but I want to ask Toby a question, because you're the main practitioner of this art form that we're discussing, narrative fiction, novel, and I don't know how much it's the general consensus, but it's certainly a strong minority consensus, if not a majority consensus, that this novel is, very beautiful from some points of view, but that it's also has shortcomings, deficiencies, and could have been better had he done this, had he done that. I'm curious from your point of view whether you think this is an achieved masterpiece of a novel or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say I think it is. I suppose, some people might argue that he's being a little bit coy about Catherine's, where she comes from. But I think that we understand that she has arisen from a catastrophe, and that there were people like her flung all over the United States and England, just sent out by this horrid blast in Europe. And So the specific, there are hints, of course, the Olympic pin, the Rhine, other things, but he doesn't concern himself with that, and he doesn't want to nail her down to a particular type. So we immediately start loading all that with all the things we already think about it or think we know about it. It allows her to retain a particular kind of individuality and not recede into a type, I think, the way he handles her. So no, I really love it. I love the writing in it. Actually, to tell you the truth, I love the bleakness of the ending. I really do.
Too.
And even, frankly, the squalor of the ending. I just think it's perfect. It is so truthful. It is truthful. And always the writer is trying to get over his or her desire to leave the reader happy, and maybe even to leave the reader loving you for writing the thing that you wrote. And boy, he refused that, and it actually takes some courage to do that. And no, I find it an uncompromising piece of art, and really, really beautiful.
Hard to end on a better note than that. But thanks for coming. We have a book that we've decided on, I think, for the fall. It's not 100% certain, but it's another masterpiece in my view. It's called Green Mansions by W.H. Hudson. And you'll be hearing more about that through our email list from Cynthia in the fall.